This resolution reverses any prior commitment or pledge by past councils to defund or abolish the police. We know that these statements were routinely cited by departing police personnel as a reason for leaving. We also know that they were very divisive.
That's Seattle City Council member Rob Saka this week, pushing the Public Safety Committee to not only find a way to end the consent decree that's been overshadowing the Seattle Police Department, but also make a promise about the so-called defund the police movement, some added intrigue to this bill, plus some legislation about after-hours lounges, what it means to be a welcoming city, a high-stakes discussion about state taxes, and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm with my co-host, none other than David Croman. David, thanks for joining me. Did the fact that the Seattle Mariners had the worst record they've ever had in spring training give you qualms? Are you doing okay? What's going on, man?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, hopefully that means they're like really experimenting and taking advantage of the meaningless games to learn great lessons that they will bring into the regular season.
I love it. Your enthusiasm really works, at least for the first couple of weeks, David. So yeah. I appreciate that for sure. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks always to our show patrons. Thanks for tuning in to your Patrons First content last week. A look at statewide issues with Representative Chapalo Street from South Seattle. Appreciate that. If you are a patron, we answer your questions on the show. You get your own fancy decal, too, so join in, why don't you? Find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and pledge your support starting at just $5 a month. Finally, a big thanks to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get rolling. Time for Right Here, Right Now. David, I wanted to start with a proposal from the Seattle City Council to regulate late-night lounges. This was in the Public Safety Committee on Tuesday morning. These are locations generally open between 2 and 6 a.m. They have socializing, dancing, not supposed to have alcohol because that's not legal at the state level. But the city points out most of the shootings in Seattle happen during the 2 a.m. hour when traditional bars are getting out, and there have been dozens of shootings and homicides connected to these lounges over the years. The council brought up 3 high-profile cases. Donnie Chin, head of the International District Emergency Center, killed in Chinatown ID in 2015. Francisco Escatel in the Soto neighborhood just last year. Then Nadia Casa, Jonathan Bishu, and Travis Ballard on Rainier Avenue South in 2023. So the new law aims to make sure these locations are up to date on their permits. They have fines of $1,000 for the first violation, $5,000 after that. Plus, they have to maintain 2 security guards, these locations do, and have video surveillance, a safety plan, and also allow entry by police officers. David, it sounds like a great idea for a crackdown here. Is it going to work? What do you think?
Yeah, when I first heard about this legislation and specifically the kind of name checking of Donnie Chin, who was killed in 2015, and his murder still hasn't been solved, I thought back to the last time that the city had tried to kind of do something around this, and it was specifically targeted at hookah lounges. That did not go very well, which you can kind of imagine why, because it created this sort of strange race dynamic between, a lot of the lounges that are owned by kind of East African folks, and then, of course, the tragedy among the Asian population. So, I've talked to people about this. The thought is they've learned the lessons from that. They're trying to kind of take a gentler approach to regulating these lounges, putting something into place that gives regulators sort of a backdoor in some ways to like bringing enforcement, because, you talked about illegal alcohol sales. The Liquor Control Board in the state is pretty overworked. And so their proactivity is going to be limited. This sort of forces some of these lounges to go on the record, essentially. And then, therefore, the anticipation is they won't do that, or they won't want to do that. And then gives local law enforcement some mechanism to crack down and try and regulate these spaces.
Does the whole idea of trying to regulate these different locations, does it push the activity underground or kind of off the radar? Is there a concern about that? And any thoughts there? I know Councilmember Hollingsworth was saying, hey, maybe there's some impacts on legal establishments too who might be concerned about this. Do you have some thoughts about that piece of it?
Yeah, it could push it underground. I think a lot of the activity is sort of happening underground already in a way, because it's happening in parking lots nearby too, and so and as far as legal businesses go, sure, I think that that will be a concern, because it's already kind of tough to be a business in Seattle. There's a lot of regulations and fees you have to pay and taxes you have to pay. But I think the thought is they're trying to write it so the burden is small enough that if you are doing this above board, it really shouldn't be that difficult for you. But again, it sort of creates a regulatory hurdle that's just barely high enough that if you're living in a place of illegality, that's still going to sort of expose those businesses to more enforcement and crackdown. And at least that's the hope. I mean, really, they're targeting 5 to 10 bars here. It's not, and they know which bars. They know where these shootings are happening. They have a very specific idea of which bars they would like to shut down, but haven't had the crackdown mechanism to do. And so my guess is if this passes, you would see kind of a flurry of activity around those specific bars, and then this ordinance would probably go quieter.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. And I think it's a very interesting point you bring up about how this is a broader issue or a broader measure than what was put forth last time with regard to hookah lounges, because in looking at this one, they're talking about Donnie Chin, they're talking about people in the Soto neighborhood, we're talking about people in Rainier Avenue South, looking at a lot of different neighborhoods, victims of all different racial backgrounds here. And I think the city's just trying to look at this as a way to deal with the shootings that are going on and try to have some regulation on the books. They can try to reduce gun violence. Will it work? We'll have to see. The full council is going to be taking on this measure on April 8th. But I did want to move on to another public safety issue with you, if I could, David. A very interesting resolution this week from the council with regard to public safety. This in the Public Safety Committee. Again, committee members have supported a measure that does the following. Appreciates first responders. Hope you're with me so far. Recognizes that the Seattle Police have made progress on several fronts and should be out from under the consent decree process they've been under since 2012. Got that. It commits to police accountability and having a diversified public safety response. So we're talking social workers, care department, etc. And this last one was the head scratcher for me, David. This resolution reverses any prior commitment or pledge by past council members to defund or abolish the SPD. Now, we all know the SPD was not defunded. The budget was reduced by a little over 10% when all the smoke cleared here a couple years ago. But the current council says this is what's been cited by police leaving the job. The council didn't support us, wanted to defund us. I just wanted to get your take on this last part of the resolution here, David, with regard to pledges of defunding police and saying that they have been reversed. What does that say to you?
There were statements of defunding the police, yes, and I think that did have an effect, likely on staffing at the Seattle Police Department, because for as much as made about how difficult it is to hire new recruits, really the problem over those last few years was how many officers they were losing. And so, yes, I think there was probably a material impact about that conversation that was happening. It should be noted, though, that was never any official policy. That was never, I think the closest it ever got, I think Councilmember Sawant had proposed, literally cutting the police department in half. I don't even think that proposal got a second.
Right.
So that was never the official policy of the Seattle Police Department.
Or the city council, right.
Or sorry, of the city council. And so, I think what's happening here by putting it on the record is, I suppose, Councilmember Saka is sort of trying to make an official statement to would-be recruits or current officers that, there is no ambiguity here about what the Seattle City Council stands for. I think that's what he's trying to do. I do think it implies that something happened that did not, that it was ever official policy of the Seattle City Council to defund the police. But again, it does put it on the record that, I think it's trying to kind of, again, kill any doubt that there is some kind of official defund the police policy in the Seattle City Council. I would say probably that message had been received already, because this council has been, they ran pretty explicitly against this, and were all elected and have spoken quite a few times about how they are different than the past council. So I would be surprised if you're the type of person who pays attention to a resolution that the Seattle City Council is passing, you probably already know where the Seattle City Council stands on this stuff. But, now they have something specific to point to, I suppose.
Fair enough. These resolutions aren't binding in the same way that ordinances are. That's a very good point. But I maybe I'm jumping the shark here. I don't know. But putting forth a statement like this, does it lock the council into a certain amount of funding for the SPD? Does the city get sued if wages don't increase by a certain amount? I just wonder if this turns into anything. I get it that it's a resolution, but I think that these we talked about this last week. There are no small measures out there. I think this is this turns into a political tool of its own, possibly.
Possibly, yeah, sure, possibly. And you're right. I mean, you can imagine scenario when the budget looks much worse than it does already, and there do need to be some cuts to the Seattle Police Department. And this has come up a bunch of times where the Seattle Police Department has extra money essentially because they're not able to hire enough officers, so they have dead salary money. If you take that and you spend it on something else, which, by the way, at the state level has not actually been a controversial thing, that the state has done that pretty regularly. But at the city level, it becomes this question of, is this defunding the police? Sure, I think you could call into question, maybe there's some like legitimate reasons to move money from the Seattle Police Department to other places.
Yeah.
At the same time, I've never been convinced that a resolution commits the city to do anything ever. So that's probably where I stand on it. It is just a resolution. It's just a statement. I don't think it is actionable on kind of either side of the issue.
Fair. I am interested to see what happens at budget time, because I think this is going to be a really difficult time for the city coming up here when it comes to revenue. And I know that police budget is a really big part of what the city has to look into this year, especially after giving officers a pretty big raise last year. So it's definitely something the council is thinking about. And you know what? Let's talk a little bit more about that up next. Looking at these state budget proposals coming out over the last couple days, looks like we're going to have a good old-fashioned tax battle on our hands. We'll take a look at what's happening in Olympia, what our local lawmakers are saying about it. Coming up next on Now Hear This. I always look at the state budget process in Olympia as an interesting way to maybe forecast how things might be going down in Seattle, at least give some ideas about where revenue's going, where some of the different taxes might be going to. And it's looking pretty rough in the state capitol right now. We've talked about this on the podcast. A $16 billion shortfall now predicted over the next 4 years. That's significant for a budget getting near $80 billion. And the revenue forecast last week was down by about $900 million for the state. So what's the plan? Well, we've been hearing it from state Democrats who hold a majority down in Olympia. They want to hit the rainy day fund, also bring in some new revenue, a wealth tax included, and increase spending by about $5.4 billion over where the state is currently. So putting the total budget at about $78.5 billion. Will there be some cuts? Yes. But I broke this down with Representative Chapalo Street, the Democrat from the 37th District last week, and he says all cuts is simply not going to fly.
You're not going to be able to raise your way out of $15 billion in revenue.
Yeah.
There is 0% chance that we can cut our way out of this. If we were to cut our way out of this, there was a all cuts budget that was like $5 billion in Medicare cuts. An optional thing in Medicare cuts is kidney dialysis, and we all know that you die without kidney dialysis. And so those are the types of cuts that we must avoid.
David, I wanted to touch on this for a couple reasons. One that I think has an interesting Seattle tie-in is the state's floating the idea of possibly having something like Seattle's jumpstart tax on the payroll of big businesses. There's a wealth tax proposed too. I know the city's been talking about that as well. Governor Ferguson has been pushing back on the idea of new taxes, but do you see him getting pushed into accepting something when it comes to new revenue? How do you see this shaking out?
I think this proposal probably has more legs than, some of the wealth tax style proposals, which are more untested. I think Seattle has used this and shown that it can be used. But Governor Ferguson has been pretty resistant to any kind of proposal like this. I will note that there was the transportation budget includes some increased gas taxes.
That's right.
Which is on a bipartisan way. So, there are Republicans who are signing off on that. So there's not a 100% opposition to new taxes.
Right.
But this would be a new source. And, I think Governor Ferguson so far we've seen has really tried to not rock the boat on stuff like this. He's been focused on staffing reductions and making cuts, trying to find cuts. I don't know if he's going to get far enough with those because the budget woes are pretty steep. So, and then, there's, as Seattle has shown, there's a lot of volatility in that tax source.
Yeah.
It's looking, I think I'm seeing something right now that's showing that the jumpstart tax is coming in smaller than they thought last year.
I see. Okay.
Which is, and so there's a lot of risk involved in that tax because it doesn't take a lot for companies to move or kind of change the way they do business. And then, and it's all tied to the stock market, basically. So stocks go up and down. That tax source goes up and down. So I'm sure there's some risk there too. But, again, when you're kind of tasked with, are you cutting schools? Or are you going to try and tax some of Washington's ultra-rich corporations? I think there's going to be a lot of support for that in the Democratic caucus.
Definitely. Yeah. And I know the Republicans have been talking about something that certainly doesn't add those new taxes, but the cuts are where this is really going to show itself. And there are a lot of different programs, Fair Start for Kids, et cetera, that might not get expanded as quickly. I know the Democrats have been talking about that. But there is one issue I'm really interested to see how this breaks down, because the Democrats did not include this Ferguson proposal. The governor was making this when he was still on the campaign trail. He wants to have a $100 million grant program to help cities and counties hire more law enforcement officers. The Senate's saying, we'll work with the governor and the House to try to make this happen in the final budget proposal. But is that going to be a deal breaker? That was a big, big promise for Ferguson on the campaign trail. And I know he's really trying to maintain that law and order image here. How do you look at that piece of it?
Yeah, I mean, Ferguson has been, that was one of the first things we heard from him when he was elected, was that he wanted to do this $100 million. Mm-hmm. There's the cynic in me would say it was us trying to signal that he is not anti-law enforcement.
Yes.
And so I don't know. I genuinely don't know this. I haven't done any reporting, but that has been accomplished. He's gotten that message out there that that's what he wants.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see if that is substantively the thing he is willing to fight for, or if he was content with just getting the message out there. Again, I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a fair question. It seems like there is a certain amount of bipartisan support for that money, though. The Democratic caucus, my sense is they want more strings attached, and that would require yet more money. So, anytime you're asking for additional money at a time like this, your odds of success go down.
Yeah, I would say so too. And I know they've been asking for some different pieces, perhaps some social services to go along with the additional money for officers, et cetera. So we'll see how that one plays out. Last question on this, David. I brought up this idea that maybe looking at how the state goes through its budget process is a bit of a harbinger for what the city has to go through. I know there are way different budget processes we're talking about here, but do you sense that at all? I know the state's looking at some revenue that doesn't look that great. I just don't think that necessarily bodes well for the city of Seattle as it looks towards its budget process coming up this fall.
No. And, the city it fixed its short-term problem, but you talk to lots of people who will say they did not fix their long-term problem, which is that, they had this tax source in this new payroll expense tax that was overperforming while the rest of the sources were underperforming, and they were able to use that to plug the hole. But it was a plug. It was not really a fix to the deeper problems. That payroll expense tax is supposed to go towards specific things. It's volatile, as we talked about. And, at the end of the day, the problem is the city scaled up a lot of programming around the pandemic and has been hesitant to ratchet any of that, very much of that back down. But there's not the same federal support for that. And so I think if you talk to a lot of people, they would say that the essential problems for the city, the systemic problems of the budget, still exist.
Yeah, very true. There was another issue the state was talking about quite a bit, this idea of dealing with federal government cuts, which still seem to be all over the place. We'll keep reporting on those as those come through. But a quick check back in city politics land. The council this week approved an ordinance that reaffirmed the city of Seattle as a welcoming city and aligned the city with the state SHIELD law. The measure is about supporting access to reproductive health care services and gender-affirming treatment in Seattle, also extending the responsibility of city employees to protect the provision of reproductive health care services and gender-affirming treatment. David, I was interested in this because here we see the city using welcoming city with the capital letters in this ordinance. I'm still not 100% sure what that means, but help me out with this. What do you make of this work to try to shield city workers in this way? The SHIELD law seemed to be very, very central to what they were talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea is it's sort of codifying into city law what state law will do. That that happens sometimes. I'm not kind of smart enough on the legal front to say why that is important to do rather than let the city law rule. I guess the idea is it allows the city to make a statement, and then in the sort of theoretical world in which the state repeals the SHIELD law, the city still has theirs. Substantively what it does, it's sends a message, I suppose, and explicitly bars city employees from turning over, any kind of information about people's sexuality,
Yes.
Or medical treatment. Of course, they wouldn't be able to turn over medical treatment anyway.
Yeah.
It is a firmly hypothetical stance at this point, which isn't to say that makes it insignificant, but there's so far not any indications that anybody has been asked to turn over this information.
Sure.
But the city is staking out a kind of moral position on this stuff, and sometimes that's done through resolutions like we talked about before, and sometimes it's done through something like this where it's substantively in the short term maybe not a huge difference, but it does put something on the official books, kind of laying out what Seattle believes about an issue.
Yeah, and the mayor brought this issue down, so we'll see what the council does with it. It is interesting to watch how a city tries to kind of make its own version of a state ordinance. I remember talking about this when the city attorney was trying to figure out, all right, when we're stopping people on the street, when should they be arrested, and what does the state say about that, and shouldn't the city have a role there? Does the city need to do these things? That's what I always come back to. I wonder about that.
Yeah, I don't know either. It was interesting that the person so Councilmember Rink had proposed an amendment today that would basically pause this law from taking effect until and if the state shield law was repealed for some reason.
Yes,
so it was
right. I saw that.
Kind of an interesting thing to put her in the position of appearing on the surface, at least to oppose this law. Her argument was, if there is some kind of challenge here, legal challenge from the federal government, the state is better equipped to take on that fight than the city. It's kind of an interesting and nuanced argument, though. Councilmember Moore, who was a judge, so knows legal stuff, said she's not particularly concerned about that. She said the city could always seek outside counsel, as they do fairly regularly, and would be positioned well enough to fight this. So Councilmember Rink's proposal failed, and then the new law ended up passing unanimously. Why this needs to be done, I don't entirely know. Again, I'm not a policy lawyer on this stuff, but it can be done, and again, the council and city hall will use its code to kind of lay out what it believes, and this is part of that. Yeah.
It's just thank you for going down this path with me, David. I'm always interested to see how the city tries to wrestle with these different federal regulations and then the state on top of that, and where it tries to insert itself too. So it's good to see some debate on the council dais about this, and thank you for talking with me about it. All right, let's warm things up a bit, shall we? To talk about pickleball, our official state sport. Well, it isn't getting all that warm a reception in one part of the city. We're taking a closer look coming up on What's Next. David, I saw this in Axios this week. I wanted to get your take. So Seattle Parks and Rec wants to build pickleball courts around Children's Hospital. There's a lot there north of the Northeast 65th Street there by the end of next year. So this plan looks like it's got about 10 courts with lights on them. The plans say you can expand possibly to 25 courts if some more funding comes in. But then you've got some local residents and environmental groups. Birds Connect Seattle is one of them, arguing that these pickleball courts are threatening the wetlands there, which are right around the corner. 100 native species of different animals happening there. These birds, they're very concerned about this. The advocacy group is warning about this. There's this pop. You've heard it when people hit a pickleball there, and that can reach up to 120 decibels courtside. I didn't realize that, and could really threaten the tranquility of the park and the wildlife too. David, I know you spent some time on Bainbridge Island, the birthplace of this sport here. Who wins out here, birds or pickleballers? What's going on?
It's incredible. I feel like I've heard this story before, and I think I have. I think wasn't this a fight in Lincoln Park too?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, down in right. Yeah, they've had that all. They did that in Lincoln Park, and they ended up pushing back successfully and said, "We're not doing it. These 6 pickleball courts here to replace an old tennis court, they're not going to go in." So that's a very good point you bring up.
And it's always about the birds versus the pickleballs. I'm no avian expert. I don't know how important it is that these birds have total peace and quiet. I think, at the same time too, I'm starting to get a little jaded about the ubiquity of pickleball. So on this side, it's kind of an interesting, the bird people and the pickleball people. That's quite the fight to create.
Yeah, no, and then sometimes you have the pickleball people versus the tennis people. The tennis people saying, wait a minute, we want our courts back, but the pickleballers are trying to take over that too. I guess what the city is trying to respond to, just looking at this with a larger lens, is a lot of people want to play this sport. And there are pro tournaments going on and things of this nature. There seems to be some friction there, I guess. And I'm not quite sure how this settles out, but I do get the feeling the city is going to see more and more of this type of activity because there's clearly a desire for it all around Seattle and beyond.
Yeah, no, clearly. I don't know. I don't I don't know how the city resolves this. I'm not discounting that people really want pickleball, nor am I discounting that it's perhaps harmful to the birds. I do just sort of sympathize a little bit with the person whose full-time job it is to mediate this argument. I also think I'm going to try and my $1 million business is going to be to come up with a quiet pickleball. Ooh. I think I could solve a lot of problems here.
Now you're talking sense. Is that a prevailing sound around Bainbridge Island area? I mean, you hear it all the time as biking by. How would you describe it?
Yeah, well, I don't live on Bainbridge anymore, but I take my kid to Battle Point Park on Bainbridge sometimes.
Yes, that's right. Okay,
we've got a good playground, and that's where the mecca of pickleball is they've like 15 courts there, and it's like always packed, and it's quite the scene. My preference for playing pickleball is usually just like with a beer or like something. I like to treat it as a lawn game. That scene is a little too serious for me.
Yeah, it is getting a lot more serious, that's for sure. So We'll see what happens. I know the Birds Connect Seattle, this is according to Axios, is going to be walking through these wetlands on Saturday to check things out. So we'll see where that story goes. Pickleballs, birds, we got a whole bunch of things to talk about going into the future here, but we do need to wrap up, David. I've been mulling around with this story for the past couple weeks here. So these two SpaceX astronauts, right? Butch Wilmore, Sonny Williams, came back to Earth a couple weeks ago. I just read this and it finally sank in for me. They were stuck in space for 286 days, which would be 278 days longer than they thought they'd be in orbit when they took off. That is crazy to me, and I'm glad they're back home. But I wanted to try to put this in perspective, David. What would be the first thing you would want to do on Earth if you were stuck in space for 9 months and didn't expect it? What do you got?
Wow. Well, probably breathe fresh air.
Step one.
I imagine everything would smell really good. Yeah, I don't know what their bathing situation is, but I imagine like swimming in a pool or something would feel really good because you got to be careful about how much water you're spraying around there, and then I don't know, jump on a trampoline or something to experience gravity.
Once again, you could have gotten some extra points for saying picking up a pickleball paddle, but that's all right. We'll leave that be for now. David, I thank you as always for joining me here. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show, and if you are not a patron, please do support the show. Why don't you? $5 a month or more on Patreon. That would be greatly supported. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you download your podcasts. We are there. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.